Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, doing our first cross-posted program today with the Seminary Ridge Museum. So we are joined by my good friend, Pete Miele. Hi, Pete. How are you?
Doing well, Jake. Thanks for having us.
We are also joined today by historian Robert Hicks of the Mutter Museum. Hello, Robert. How are you?
I'm fine, Jake. Thank you.
Excellent. So we are doing one of these programs yet again for our digital history side of things at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Since we can't be open to the public due to the pandemic, we've been doing online programs like this. And so this is going to be our first, like I mentioned, cross-posted program. So you can watch us live on the National Museum of Civil War Medicine channel, like some of you I'm sure are, or you may be watching live on the Seminary Ridge Facebook page, which is fantastic, and we hope to do more of these programs in the future. If you would like to support these kinds of programs, you can become a member of our institution. You can become a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. You will see a link, if you're watching on the Civil War Med Facebook page, you will see a link soon for where you can do that. If you are watching on the Seminary Ridge page, Pete, is there any way that...
Yes, we can do that as well. Yes, thank you for reminding me.
Excellent. So if you want to support institutions like ours, you can join as members, you can donate, you can like and share these videos. That is going to be super helpful to us. It allows more people to join in the conversation. And we hope you are going to enjoy today's program, which we are going to talk at length about Confederate vaccination during the Civil War. And that is why we have the expert himself, Robert Hicks.
All right.
Robert, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thanks very much, Jake. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy self-quarantine to learn more about more disease at another moment in our national history. Vaccination, pure and spurious. I will make it clear what I mean by both pure and spurious in a moment, but by way of a little introduction, I am representing the Mutter Museum for almost 12 years now. I was director of this museum and also head of the Historical Medical Library. Now I'm a consulting scholar. But I'm here today representing my institution. Birthplace of American Medicine is what you see on the screen. We humbly bear that label, since physicians who got together and created a professional fraternal organization, that is the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, aim to pool their talents to improve the profession, and as they said at the time, do what they can do to reduce human suffering. So those physicians...
Jump in for 1 sec. You're not screen sharing. I just want to make sure.
I'm not screen sharing?
Not yet, no.
Pardon us for the moment.
What? I'm sorry. So nobody heard anything.
We heard you, but we don't see the PowerPoint yet. There we go. Now we're good. We're perfect. All systems go. Sorry about that.
Okay. I will back up slightly. All right. There we go with our beginning slide.
There we go.
Okay. I'm working with a couple of screens here, so if my face comes and goes, now you'll know. All right. So there's the first screen with great images of smallpox and a Grim Reaper smallpox. Now we will move along. As I was talking about, the College of Physicians is a National Historic Landmark, and the museum, which we like to describe as disturbingly informative. And if you're not familiar with this museum, it's probably the preeminent medical history museum in the country, which means we've got bones and things in jars that make people a little strange sometimes, but it's worth coming. And we have a long-term exhibition that opened up last October, and my colleagues think that there is a strange relationship between the appearance of the coronavirus and my opening this exhibit. And I think that I may be responsible for the virus, but I'm maintaining electronic distancing at the moment, so no worries there. But we do have a major exhibition up on the influenza pandemic of 1918. And there's been a fair amount of this in the press lately because journalists have been interested in comparing what's happening now with what's happening then. And I think you'll find some other points of comparison between now and the Civil War, you'll see. But let me begin with a moment in the months immediately after the war. And Jake may be cutting out my image here in a moment and bringing me back in when we do a Q&A. It will be easier for you to see the complete PowerPoint screen that way. This is something you may have heard of. Captain Henry Wirtz was the Confederate commandant of the Andersonville prisoner of war camp in Georgia. Now, the photograph in the upper left of that hugely emaciated man, in a way, he's a concentration camp victim. He is a man starving to death, but still alive, as he was released at the end of the war from Andersonville. And there was a widely publicized trial within months after the war's ending of this man, who was convicted and hanged. It was a war crimes trial. And the reason I bring it up is one of the allegations made against Captain Wirtz was that the Confederate physicians at the Andersonville POW camp deliberately infected Union soldiers with bad smallpox vaccine. So we had medical experimentation on top of starving prisoners. So we're going to return to that, but hold that thought. There are problems stirring in the Confederacy. Let's go to the Battle of Antietam, 1862, bloodiest day in American history. Now, the Confederate Army that left Antietam carried with it smallpox, and a smallpox epidemic broke out, the first significant one in the South during the Civil War, and almost at the beginning of the war, as you see here from 1862. After the war, both North and South agreed that while there were disease outbreaks here and there, including smallpox, even in the North, the South seemed to bear the brunt of this in a very significant way. There were multiple outbreaks. Now, in Richmond, the next year, the capital of the Confederacy, there was a second smallpox outbreak. And as described at the time, people in that city were panic-stricken by the spread of the disease. Now, there's very little vaccine on hand, and it's worth mentioning that the only disease you could be vaccinated against anywhere in 1862 or 1863 was smallpox. And the mechanism of that will become clear in a little bit. So now the capital of the Confederacy is in the grip of this. An emergency order was decreed to vaccinate all Confederate government employees. So one of the Confederate surgeons by the name of Bolton was given the assignment, and he vaccinated 1,300 people. And he was proud of himself afterwards that only one of those vaccinations failed to take, which probably meant that person had to be revaccinated pretty darn quick. Now, in order to create vaccine for this purpose, the method may sound a bit bizarre. Bolton went to children who had a form of the pox virus called vaccine disease or vaccinia, otherwise known as cowpox. I call it smallpox light. Usually is not mortal, has similar symptoms, clears up quickly, and importantly, leaves you immune. Well, he took some children and deliberately placed into their skin lymph, or the fluid in the pustules that form in smallpox or vaccinia sufferers. So the liquid that's in the pustule is being drained and then stuck into the arm of a healthy child. The child presumably will get the disease, go through the cycle, and this lymph can be harvested again. Now, why would you want to do this? This is vaccination. Taking a substance from a sick person, placing that substance into a healthy person, that person presumably will undergo a very mild course of the disease with the huge benefit that upon recovery, you're immune. So this is what Bolton was doing. He's tampering with children and vaccinating the Confederate bureaucracy. Now, this isn't quite an accurate map of the Confederacy. It shows North and South segregated, but of course, some of these are actually border states aligned with the North, although they're slaveholding states. And as you know from your history, it was touch and go for some of them to what degree they would stay in the war on behalf of the Union. I have the map up here because by 1863 to 1864, every Confederate division had smallpox cases. And you can almost follow the routes as Confederate soldiers, sailors, munitions, supplies are trafficked on the major rivers. So wherever those rivers go, you can expect smallpox to go. I'm not suggesting a link between the disease itself and waterborne transportation. It's just that people with the disease can get around easily this way and spread it. Now, I have a statistic here that mortality was about 28.5%. Almost a third of those in the South who contracted smallpox died of it. The average ranged from 1 in every 5 or 6 Confederate soldiers to 1 in every 14. For the North, the average pretty consistently throughout the war was about 1 soldier in every 5. But the South had this wildly fluctuating spread of the disease with on the average, a fairly substantial mortality for those stricken. And here we see a delightful image of a man with the pox, smallpox, on the face. And the pox, we spell it P-O-X, initially it was P-O-C-K-S, refers to those raised bumps. And this particular image shows a man with a fairly advanced set because those spots appear and transform. You also see an image of an arm with a smallpox sore. This is pretty much what it looks like. It's almost donut shaped. It's raised with a little shallow depression in the middle. The arm here shows a sort of rose-colored glow around it and then some kind of a ring. And this is a smallpox pustule at about day 8 or 9. The photograph you see below is what that changing pustule tends to look like in a human. Now, Private Smith, 60th Georgia, is 22 years old. He's been vaccinated in both arms while he was stationed in Danville, Virginia. He goes through a predictable course of response. And by the way, why 2 arms? Well, in case one of the vaccinations doesn't take, maybe the other one will. So there was a risk of failure here. So it's redundancy. Now, this was taking place in January of 1863, and the vaccination sores went from the normal, which is what you see in the image at right, to something much, much worse. Ulcers started to break out in and around the sores and extended up and down the arm. And a surgeon describes this man as covered with thick, elevated scabs. And even worse, they seemed to exude pus and they stank. So what is going on here? This is one of the early cases of what will be many, where a smallpox vaccination starts to go very, very wrong. Same month, different place, the chief surgeon of the Rhodes Division in the Army of Northern Virginia is looking at a huge outbreak of cases, something like Smith's. He has 227 instances of them, and he is dubbing this spurious vaccinia, or spurious vaccine. By spurious, he means any phenomena incident to the vaccination that are not supposed to be there. So you've seen the raised pustule. Initially, it's a red spot, modifies over time, and there's a predictable sequence for a quote unquote routine or healthy sufferer. That is somebody who's going through it without contamination by anything else and is probably going to survive, get better, and be immune. Now, I mentioned vaccinia or vaccine disease. Today, smallpox is classified as an orthopox virus. It's a family, a spectrum of diseases. In very much the same way that today with coronavirus, that sits on a spectrum of upper respiratory viruses. And somewhere on that spectrum, of course, is flu, and flu has many, many variants, as coronavirus apparently does too. Well, vaccine disease is the disease that you get upon vaccine administration. It's the vaccinia. It's the smallpox light that I was describing. Cowpox is a form of pox with very similar apparent symptoms, but in cows. And we will get to the moment in a moment with the famous Edward Jenner, who discovered the link between cowpox and smallpox and thereby invented vaccination. So now we have this Army of Northern Virginia with hundreds of cases. And the prevalence of these cases here, plus reports coming in from other physicians, are causing the Confederate medical bureaucracy some headaches. And they form a commission to look into it and find out why they're having these spurious cases. So enter the Surgeon General of the Confederacy, Surgeon Preston Moore. Now, Moore was regarded by his colleagues as extremely proficient, efficient, and dictatorial. Pleasant man to work with, he was not. And perhaps his shortness of temper was due to the fact that he had relatively little resources to work with and a lot of guesswork to contend with, plus a lot of medical supplies to find. But he was also interested in creating a professional cadre of physicians who would rise above the day-to-day administration of medicines and minor surgeries, or major surgeries as it turned out, but also make an inquiry into why things happen. And when they see anomalies and patterns, they should pursue them and see where they go. To that end, he established a technical journal, the Confederate States Medical Journal, which was in print for about the last year of the war. He also created an association of physicians so that they could meet, have professional dialogue, and improve the standards of their work. The Association of Army and Navy Surgeons of the Confederate States was the name of this. So he's paying attention to these reports coming in of vaccinations gone very, very wrong. Richmond, not only being the capital of the Confederacy, also had the largest hospital, north or south, Chimborazo Hospital, which was so named because of the hill it was located on the east end of Richmond. And here you see buildings atop a hill. The James River was below, and the reason for the hilltop site was to avoid the mosquitoes and some of the swampy conditions and get some clean, fresh air, which apparently did on the whole work. And this is a mock-up of a space in that hospital and what your Confederate recovering patient probably looked like in his surroundings. Moore designated this hospital as a receiving hospital to concentrate both smallpox cases as well as those exhibiting these abnormal results, the spurious vaccination results. So he's doing a very scientific thing in trying to isolate and group patients for a study rather than of individuals suffering from these phenomena at diverse locations, bring them to a central place where you could have all the medical minds gathered and look at these as a problem affecting a population, not simply individual by individual. Surgeon S.M. Bemis of the Army of Northern Virginia also reported in an acute outbreak among the 12th and Georgia Infantry regiments. And in this case, he and some other physicians did what we hear physicians talking about, something we need to do today with coronavirus, the idea of contact tracing. About 100 soldiers ended up exhibiting these ghastly ulcerated sores incident to vaccinations. And they interviewed all of these men and found out that every one of these men had been vaccinated through a self-administered process using lymph that came from a single soldier who had come back from a leave of absence, a man described as having very dissolute habits. And I think we know what that means he did on leave. Well, he comes back, but the physicians are not involved in the spread of this. What's happened is the soldiers see how doctors administer vaccinations. They prick the skin, they put some of the substance into a shallow wound, and then the person gets the disease through it and then comes out immune. The soldiers think, great idea, let's do it ourselves. I know a guy with pustules, let's go drain them. So that's effectively what happened to this man on leave. He's using lymph from his own outbreak of disease and exchanging this lymph with other soldiers. They're putting this in their bodies. So anything that came from a pustule on this body is now in the bloodstream of 100 other guys, which means anything he had initially, such as venereal disease, is now making its way through a population of 100 soldiers. Now, remember at the time, we do not have a germ theory that is based on a knowledge we have now of both how viruses and bacteria work within bodies and how contagion operates. Their notions were a bit different, not wrong in every case. They were good empiricists. They made observations and drew conclusions. In this case, they realized something was in that dissolute soldier's habits, in that soldier's body, that became part of the transmission of a vaccine, the lymph that's being shared by these soldiers. The diseases that are starting to show up incident to vaccination include scurvy, syphilis, gangrene, and this bacterial skin disease you see here called erysipelas. But syphilis seemed to be the predominant disease. Well, if you're an Army commander, you don't want to hear this. You don't want to know that this is going on and that your soldiers are effectively self-vaccinating using their own knives or maybe a prick of bayonet in order to effectively spread disease in the effort to vaccinate themselves. By the time the Battle of Chancellorsville takes place, we have some serious large-scale problems facing Confederate commanders in the field. There were 5,000 Confederate soldiers on the day of the Chancellorsville battle that could not be brought into the battle and had to be sidelined because all of them had some manifestation of a disease or complication owing to a spurious vaccination. So now this problem has increased to a very, very big scale. And again, with the investigation physicians are conducting and how this happened, they realize soldiers are once again inoculating themselves. Now, before I go any further, accompanying this presentation today, I've got 2 Word documents that I believe are being made available to you. One is a flowchart. It's a vaccination flowchart because I'm not going to go into the technical detail about how doctors made decisions, how they evaluated the phenomena they were seeing, made decisions to revaccinate or not vaccinate if they were dealing, say, with a sick soldier. So I put it all in the form of a flowchart, and you can see the decision chain that a Confederate surgeon, that is an attentive one, went through. And when I say Confederate surgeon, that means Confederate doctor. All doctors in military service were called surgeons. The other handout is a reading list. Some of the sources have hyperlinks associated with them in case you want to read some of this primary material online. So now you know. Let's talk about smallpox for a moment and why the big threat. And to be clear on a couple of terms that were in use at the time. Smallpox is the most contagious, high mortality disease the world has experienced. So finding a vaccine for it as early as the 18th century was really a big move forward. At the time, physicians, and you'll see this in the textbooks of the time for physicians, inhaling effluvia was believed to be the main source of contagion. So that means anything coming out of my mouth in conversation with you at a non-social distance could get into your system. And in fact, if you look at maybe CDC information on smallpox, what it is and how it affects people, although it is not an active disease in the world today, we hope, you'll see that today, with our own germ theory and our DNA and all of our technology, we still understand the method of contagion to be just about the same thing. You can share the airspace with somebody with smallpox and come down with it yourself. Now, some terms that may not be familiar: variolation. The scientific name at the time, or the Latin name for smallpox, was variola. So the literature of the period uses the term variola or varioloid, or vaccination against variola, but they're talking about smallpox. Variolation describes the technique, which had been known for some time before the Civil War, of taking some of the lymph or liquid again in the pustule manifested by a sore on the body of an infected person, draining that and inserting it in somebody else. Now, this means you'd go to an active smallpox patient to do this. You are hoping, and this tends to be the consequence, that when you inject somebody healthy with this bit of disease liquid, they will go through a milder form of disease. Generally, that is what takes place. But that technique is called variolation. Now, infection and virus are, of course, terms that we use today. Infection at the time of the Civil War meant essentially anybody with a disease that could probably be communicated to somebody else. Virus referred to the substance of the disease itself, which we would know today to be something at a micro level, detectable maybe with an electron microscope, that gets into cells of the body and makes changes in the DNA of those cells and thus propagates the disease. To a Civil War doctor, virus simply meant it's the disease-causing agent. We don't know exactly what it is. We know it's there, and we know it's very, very tiny, and we cannot actually detect it. Now, vaccination versus inoculation. The terms can get confusing: variolation, vaccination, inoculation. But vaccination technically meant the injection of cowpox or vaccinia, the mild pox-related virus that has similar symptoms. This owes to the big discovery that Edward Jenner made. I got a slide on that coming up in a moment. So inoculation is not that. That would be taking, say, something from a smallpox infected person and injecting it into another. So we have the term variolation, inoculation, and doctors are tending at the time to use these almost synonymously. But a doctor who administers a vaccine just isn't saying, hey, body, step up. If you haven't had this disease, I'm going to give you this vaccine and then go away, suffer for 2 weeks, and you'll be fine. But doctors at the time appraised a person's health in the totality, in a very holistic way. Now, granted, if you're in the Army, there's not a lot of time to do a lot of this, but the vaccine you administer, or say any medicine you might administer, needs to take into consideration the capabilities, the body, the environment of the person that you're treating. In other words, you need to know something about who they are, even what they have done for a skill or trade, even their education, their upbringing, where they grew up. Environmental circumstances might be important. So the totality of lifestyle and physical makeup is something the physician is supposed to take in and evaluate in making decisions about treating people. Now here's our friend Edward Jenner, and his big insight was to realize that young women who were milking cows who had a form of pox called cowpox were developing these pustules, as you see here, on the udders. And the maids would milk these udders and get the similar spots on their arms. Jenner realized, this great insight, was that these are very, very similar to the pox in a smallpox case. And yet these cowgirls get this disease from the cows, and once they've had it, it doesn't come back. So he reasoned, could it be that this is related to smallpox, and if we injected the cowpox material into a healthy person, what would happen? Well, he found, of course, that they would get a mild course of the disease, the vaccinia or cowpox, but then when they recovered, they were immune to the big deal, smallpox. So he was the one who was the real progenitor of smallpox vaccination at the end of the 1700s. And his observations were still state of the art at the time of our Civil War. But he also pointed out that physicians administering have to be very, very careful to observe, not just the nature of the body they're administering it to, but they have to look at the nature of the disease and how it progresses through that approximate 2-week to 3-week period. And diseases are classified according to the frequency of appearance of certain phenomena, how long they last, and how bad they can be. You don't necessarily know you have a smallpox case just because red spots appear on somebody. It could be measles. You have to watch, and it's not until a few days in that you're able to say, I see where this is going. It is now smallpox. So let's talk about the vaccination cycle itself for just a moment. A person who comes down with smallpox does not show these sort of pustules that you see in the illustration. And notice it says variola at the base of that illustration, in parentheses, the smallpox. But red spots would appear, but accompanied by the headaches, the fever, the general malaise, tiredness, sore joints, phenomena that could be associated with all kinds of diseases. But with vaccination, you expect a person to develop the symptoms I've just described, but then go on to a predictable sequence of events that you have to observe very closely, and also time. because if you're going to then let this person, or if person's been vaccinated, you may want to harvest lymph from their pustules. You have to do it at precisely the right moment. At precisely the wrong moment, that lymph is now poison. So you have to get it just right. So this is why soldiers doing this to themselves were making all kinds of mistakes. The raised area that starts to emerge from the red spot is called a vesicle, and it starts to fill with liquid. And the day of greatest perfection was when it turned into a pearly luster, a nice, I almost want to say healthy looking pustule. But then it starts to change color, a redness appears around it and sort of an areola around it, and it begins to dry up. Eventually it'll fall off as a scab. And if you're at least my age, I'm in my 60s, and remember when smallpox vaccination was still administered, we had to, as children, go through a very mild course of the disease, but at the end, there was a scab on the arm, on the shoulder, and it would drop off and leave a particular scar that was a clear indication that you have had the smallpox vaccination. This isn't done anymore because all you youngins have grown up in a world without smallpox. So far, I hasten to say. So the pock appears first. Remember, it has a depressed center, but it changes into a pustule and then a scab, or also called a crust at that time. The cases that were considered high mortality is when those sores, if you look at the illustration here, if they began to take on the appearance of coalescing into larger and larger masses, as if they're all feeding together into one big amoeba of a sore, that's almost a death sign. That's probably going to be a mortal case. So the tools that are used are pretty much this. On the left-hand side, you see a couple of folding knives. The smaller one in a tortoise shell is a lancet, has a sharp point. The other item is called a fleam, the larger one, where it's almost like a fold-out pocket knife, and you have a lever with a blade. Some of these have multiple blades. They could be used for children, for adults, and then for farm animals, for bleeding purposes. A lancet could be all that you would need, along with a person who has the pustule. So you can pierce them and then take the anointed end of that lancet and stick it in the arm of a healthy person. But on the right, you see an actual kit that was made up specifically for vaccination during this era. Up at the top are two glass plates. They nestle into one another, into that recess where you see the manufacturer's label, Gemrig. And you see two different lancets that are included with this kit. The one on the right is a general purpose lancet. The one on the left has been contoured specifically for smallpox vaccination, for piercing those lymph-filled pox. Now, the reason for the glass is if you take out some of that lymph and you got a glob of it on your lancet, you empty it onto a plate, add a little water, put the other plate on top, mix it around, and you've just made some vaccine for yourself. And you then dip a clean lancet into that mixture and start going around anointing, or rather vaccinating healthy people. Now, you see at the very bottom a little tin that's open with a sliding lid. That tin is in that kit on the right-hand side. It's very tiny, but inside are scab remnants. And this comes from the collection of the Mutter Museum, which still has its original 19th century scabs still in there awaiting use by a doctor. Now, I've got coming up some images of surgeons, and these surgeons that I have coming up are not specifically identified in my presentation, but since I'm talking a lot about doctors in the Confederacy, I thought I ought to give you some pictures of some. So you're going to see some just to give you some faces to the activities that I'm describing. Now, the surgeons, we have to understand, participate in a culture of medicine that is not entirely familiar to us today. And the people they're treating participate in that. And so some of these are rituals. Think of the physician who would travel making house calls with a doctor's kit. And the doctor's kit would have the iconic instruments in it, of a stethoscope and maybe other things too. Well, surgeons had objects that not only served professional needs, but they were also emblems of authority, emblems of familiarity, both to soldiers who are citizens and might have experienced a doctor's treatment before. So there is a shared understanding of what it means to get sick, what it means to get well, and there's an understanding that the physician is not there to cure you. the physician is to do something, whether it's give you a medicine, something else, administer another therapy, that's designed to let nature do its thing, to help nature get you to recover. Now, surgeons are also part of a professional network that is also part of this vaccine story. Surgeons just don't magically have vaccine in their kit. They have to deal with medical purveyors who go out and procure supplies, medical supplies for the Confederate Army. The North operates the same way. And they're also hospital stewards, ambulance drivers. There are nurses who could be invalid soldiers or even women. There are a variety of people who become familiar with some of what the surgeon does, participate in some way with surgical activities, and may actually participate in vaccination procedures. But doctors are expected to have very acutely developed observational skills, and this is the foundation of real science. These doctors are creating knowledge by focusing on the problems that the vaccinations are contributing to the Army. They have a driving necessity to figure out what these abnormal vaccinations are all about and stop it. They can't afford to lose troops. They're also finding out that there are a range of animals out there, not just cows, that can also exhibit pox diseases. So if you have a mind oriented to observation and analysis, which again, these are foundation skills for scientific work, you're going to be asking a lot of questions, gathering data. I've already talked about the contact tracing that went on to identify the source of the problem. That is soldiers vaccinating themselves in most cases with lymph taken from bloodstreams that had other diseases in them, particularly venereal disease, syphilis. So these doctors, by tending to this problem, are observing, are interviewing soldiers, are documenting what they're finding out. They're contributing knowledge to a central authority, that is the Surgeon General's office. And as this problem continues to resonate throughout the Confederacy, Preston Moore is about to become very dogmatic about what the problem is and how it's supposed to be solved. And he's looking at the data these doctors are accumulating. Now, the Confederacy, of course, is subject to a Union blockade. And this blockade is preventing medicines from coming from other countries or even from the North into the South. Manufacturing facilities for drugs in the South are de minimis. Here you see ads on the right-hand side, Pure Vaccine, French Vaccine. This is from a trade newsletter, a chemical and medical trade newsletter that was published in New York during the war. So if you're a medical purveyor in the North looking for supplies, you buy them on the market. You would go to these vendors and buy this. Some of the Confederate surgeons would love to get some of this material, and they would have to get it by subterfuge. But this is how vaccine is advertised. Vaccine does not actually show up in the medical Confederate supply list. Both the Confederacy and the Union Medical Corps had established lists of medicines that were to be used or compounded to make other medicines that the physician might need. Vaccine does not appear. Vaccine seems to occupy a category unto itself. I want to call your attention to a very strange ad, and it's in the lower left, where it says vaccine virus from healthy white children. For now, just take note of that, and we're going to come back to this in a significant way. Surgeon General Moore starts issuing some circulars to all Confederate surgeons about this problem. In particular, he identifies the problem, describes the spurious vaccination phenomenon that's happening, summarizes what has been learned to date. Also, it begins to identify a problem that all these Confederate surgeons may be reluctant to recognize, but the Surgeon General decides, this is what I got to tell you, folks, and you're not going to like it. Doctors, this is your fault. Why is he saying that? The information that he is learning tells him that doctors administering vaccination are following a wide variety of practices with little consistency. And he is laying the blame for these spurious vaccinations at the feet of doctors. He says, you guys have to buck up and do this in a regimented, way, following a very discrete protocol, and you need to document your findings and pay very, very close attention to your vaccine sources. So he's putting the doctors on notice that they've got to buck up. He ends up following this up with other circulars where he takes this a step further and says, not only have I said you must treat this as a significant priority in the Confederate Army and devote attention to solving this problem and treating these cases, but I'm going to tell you how we're going to end this. And the only way we're going to end this is to have a protocol that is mandatory, and everybody's going to follow this. You can do exactly what I say. And he then lists step by step exactly how this is to be accomplished. He even tells the surgeon, you take the vaccine in your left arm. You take the arm of the patient in the right. You take your index finger and your thumb and you spread them apart. So to spread the elasticity of the skin, you're going to puncture it with a lancet. You are going to puncture it only dermal deep so that you're not drawing blood. And then you're going to insert the vaccine there, remove your fingers, allow the skin's elasticity to enclose that. You're going to do it this way, that way, and the other way. He gives specific instructions about how to use the kit that I just illustrated. So the Surgeon General figures by mandating a very tight list of techniques to be followed in every instance, it's one way to ensure conformity and make sure we can reduce these abnormal vaccinations that are so debilitating the Confederate Army. He even says, for example, that I recognize that we have lancets in common use for a variety of purposes, and you're probably using a lancet to vaccinate that you're using for all kinds of other problems. Well, that's got to stop. And here's how you're going to do it. You're going to take one lancet, clean it off, and break off the tip. So you know that that broken lancet is to be used for vaccinations exclusively, nothing else. So this is the kind of method that Moore is adopting to try to get at the root of this problem and solve it, because he's got all kinds of other medical problems to deal with. Come back to Chimborazo Hospital. Turning his attention back to the hospitals, Moore realizes we need to not only tighten up the procedure by which we administer vaccinations, but we've got to create a documentation trail. So a soldier who's been, say, vaccinated in this hospital and becomes healthy again and is released back to his unit has to return with effectively a ticket or a voucher that stipulates, I have been vaccinated on this date, this time, this is the person who vaccinated me. So there's a paper trail, and the soldier himself carries that paper with him wherever he goes and to whatever medical officer he reports to. So Moore is trying to extend control over the entire process of this, from the creation of the vaccine itself, from obtaining it from a reliable source, getting it into medical circulation within the Army, making sure a shelf life is observed for it, because liquid lymph isn't going to last long, particularly in a warm southern environment. And he takes it a step further, realizing we can't just exercise these procedures with soldiers. We need to go after the entire civilian population of the South. So he assigns a Confederate surgeon to essentially be the surgeon of record in every Confederate state's city, to be essentially vaccine officer for that city, for that community. If it's a large city, he can appoint others to help him, but he'll be in charge. So every city now has a military medical authority that's going to insist on mandatory evacuation. This is going to be very interesting, because as we see today with people who cannot stand another day of quarantine, when they can't go to the barbershop or go to the gym, they take their assault rifles and go into a legislative assembly in another state. So people don't like being told what to do in a military situation, as well as in any other capacity of life. So Moore has to be extremely dogmatic, and by virtue of him being a military doctor, he has a military chain of command and military authorities who are going to back this up. And soldiers with bayonets, they're going to make sure people get vaccinated. This brings me back to the children again. You may recall the ad about the healthy white children. These are vaccine suppliers that are using children, white children in that case, to inject with lymph from sick people watch these children go through the cycle, and as they have lymph sores, those sores are then drained to provide vaccination for even more people. So why children in the first place? Well, take our example of the guy in Rhodes Division who went home on leave and vaccinated himself, or took his own lymph and started vaccinating other people and created a problem with syphilis. Adults have diseases. Children, whether they're Black or white, are viewed as far more pristine in a health sense, unlikely to harbor other diseases that could get into the mix. Also, plantations are rural. They're effectively isolated. So the children that may live on those plantations aren't going anywhere else. So they represent a stable population to cultivate disease under controlled conditions. Remember our friend Surgeon Bolton, who was inoculating people in Richmond? Well, that same guy had the job of visiting the plantations on a kind of circuit to find children that have the disease, drain their lymph, inject healthy people, come back later on, and when children are healthy or other children in that community on the plantations, he's going to inject those people to get them sick so they have a ready supply of vaccine. Some doctors are actually keeping at the ready a pox-ridden child. One Tennessee doctor did this by keeping a child at any given moment in a state of day 8 or day 9 of vaccinia, where you've got the pustule in the lymph at its ideal moment. And he would keep inoculating people to keep this repetition going. So he always had some child in his stable who would be a ready supply of fresh lymph. So this is a bit strange to our ears, and there is no documentation of any specific protocol that the Confederacy was following with respect to children, such as getting parental permission. I don't think that was even considered. They simply showed up on the plantations and said, bring your kids, we got work to do. So in this top ad that was in a newspaper, it says Negro Hospital, and you have two very well-known Confederate military surgeons whose names appear here, Chisholm and Porcher. Porcher developed a specialty in administering medicine to Black people in the South. Now, there's certainly a lot of ideological issues attached to the health of Black people as perceived by white surgeons, particularly in the South at this time. But it also shows that Black people are getting sick too, and it may be the Confederacy, but if you want to keep a slave population or any population healthy and free of infecting other people, you got to have a hospital for them. So Black children, particularly on plantations, are now being used as vaccine sources. Remember, the Confederacy cannot buy on an open market supplies from abroad, so they have to resort to this kind of a situation. Let's get back to the public health rule. Surgeon General Moore is now doing something which is pushing into a larger domain, which has legal obstacles, legal pitfalls, and also social implications. By maintaining that we now have to vaccinate civilians, he's now forcing civilians to do things. This is a significant stepping beyond a military role into the civilian sphere. It's tantamount to martial law, but we do know that there were civilians in the South who really were not happy about this, as they were unhappy with other extreme measures the Confederacy had to take to maintain its army at the expense of civilian population. So by 1865, with the end of the war, unfortunately, when the Confederates torched Richmond on the way out, that's where most of the medical records of the Confederacy were located, including a very substantial report on the spurious vaccination phenomena that had been compiled at Surgeon Moore's request. It had gone up in flames. Enter this man, Joseph Jones. He may not be a household word to people who are devout readers of Civil War historical literature, but he had a very unusual job. In fact, he was Northern trained. Before the war, he went to Princeton, got a degree. He went to the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, one of the 2 or 3 top medical schools in the country. But when the war broke out, he, along with many other Southern medical students, went south and offered their services. But he had a very unusual job during the war. He was not assigned as a regimental surgeon. He was essentially a freelance researcher reporting directly to the Surgeon General. And he took on special projects and special assignments as the need arose. And one of them was our spurious vaccination phenomenon. So Jones, during the war, had compiled a report on the abnormal vaccination problem with observations by physicians and some general conclusions. And this, to his great regret after the war, had disappeared. And in fact, he grumblingly refers to those plundering Union soldiers that, in their ignorance, were just willy-nilly destroying a lot of Confederate records, baggage of escaping Confederates from Richmond, and so on and so forth. He decides that this report on spurious vaccination is so important, it needs to be resurrected. So the year after the war, he's on the faculty at the University of Nashville Medical School. And he decides to write to ex-Confederate surgeons all over the South who might have contributed to this original report. And his question is, can you please write me back and recall anything, any statistics, any observations, anything you recall about this phenomenon? So he gets the letters. And based on the letters, he compiles this report, Researches upon Spurious Vaccination. In my handout, there's at least one link to an online version of this, so you can read it for yourself. But let me warn you, Joseph Jones may have been a very intelligent, insightful guy, but he is a hell of a bad writer, and he does not know how to synthesize information. And he was told when he submitted his medical thesis that he needed to shorten it from, I think, approximately 600 pages, which he did, but with great difficulty for him. So unfortunately, this document is rather long. It's a bit tedious reading because the information is not well synthesized. But he does come up with some important conclusions. He recognizes that soldiers in the field who are malnourished or might be suffering from extreme stress and fatigue owing to long campaigns with poor food and on the march and so on, should not be vaccinated at all. Their bodies would not be receptive to the vaccine, and the likelihood of these spurious responses would happen. Remember, they don't have DNA, they don't have that kind of technology to probe the nature of disease. So he's not able to say, look, do not take lymph from somebody who has syphilis, although that does become a practice. In terms of creating knowledge about how to do this better in the future, one of the things that Confederate surgeons learned was simply that. Be very careful about what identifiable diseases your vaccine source subjects might have, and don't take vaccine from them if they're manifesting those symptoms, or if they're heavily fatigued or malnourished. Now this brings us back to Captain Wirtz again. The connection here is Joseph Jones. One of the assignments that Surgeon General Moore gave Jones was to go out to Andersonville and investigate what's going on there. What is the medical situation? Moore was getting plenty of reports about the bad conditions at Andersonville. Plus the Union press, of course, in the North was saying quite a bit about this. So Joseph Jones prepared a report on Andersonville, which he never delivered to Surgeon General Moore because the war had just ended. So what happens? Since the Union Army moved very quickly to identify Wirtz and put him in custody and bring him to trial at the end of summer 1865, they subpoenaed Joseph Jones and his report. They took his report from him against his will because he knew it was going to be used as evidence against a Confederate officer. But he was compelled to testify, and he testified about the Andersonville conditions. He could not lend any credence to any idea that surgeons were trying to deliberately poison Union soldiers with impure vaccine. In other words, deliberately creating the spurious vaccination phenomena that could poison these soldiers. The military medical people at Andersonville were no better supplied than anybody else at the infrastructure at Andersonville. So that sort of went by the wayside. As you know, Wirtz was nevertheless convicted and hanged, but I wanted you to know that the smallpox vaccination problem actually surfaced in a major war crimes trial that followed the Civil War. So what do we get out of this? The military control over civic life, I put some emphasis on because that was something the Confederacy faced But then as the country is reunified, the North absorbs the entire medical experience of the Southern doctors into its own reports. What the Southern doctors did, what extant publications there were, got absorbed into the Northern literature. So everybody began to learn what the Southern physicians learned, trying to deal with this problem of impure vaccination. The North compiled the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. And there's at least a facsimile version of this exists in some libraries. The College of Physicians Library has a facsimile, if you should want to visit. Also has original copies from the 1870s and 80s, published in several volumes. It's like a massive encyclopedia. And it absorbs everything that the Union government was able to get out of the South after the war, absorb their medical findings and reports. So their observations about abnormal vaccinations were absorbed into this larger report of everything that was learned during the war. So this is knowledge produced. Plus, we have in the report that Jones produced all these caveats about vaccination, the source of vaccine, the nature of the vaccine, understanding vaccine sources. And there was a lot of experimentation went on that was documented in this report that Jones created by resurrecting this topic and getting all those doctors to contribute. Interesting, though, it's also a window on how the South was coping with itself during Reconstruction in the immediate post-war years. There was a huge Black diaspora out of the South, and doctors, former military doctors in the South, were extremely worried that these Black people were going to carry smallpox everywhere. So white people were flocking to doctors to be revaccinated. Even if they'd been vaccinated against smallpox once upon a time, they wanted it done again. They wanted it done fresh because they saw these people on the road as a public health threat. So understanding how disease also shaped some attitudes about how the South was to recover after the war does shed a bit of a different light on the decisions people were making. Now, cows I have at the bottom because here we've been looking at the South using humanized vaccine deriving from wounds, sores on essentially vaccinated people or people who have gotten vaccine or smallpox on their own, and then recirculated. Attempts were made to take the humanized virus, inject it into cows, see if the cow would then respond by getting sick, and then harvest the cow's lymph to maybe speed up the process of making vaccine. That did not work, but it shows you there was a range of experimentation done to explore permutations to the vaccination process to see if it could be improved, also to find more reliable sources. And oddly enough, it was just a few years after the war ends that humanized virus ceases to be used altogether. It becomes cows, and a particular breed of cows was developed in France, exported to the United States. And in fact, in Pennsylvania, there was a major vaccine farm developed which lasted until the 1920s and 1940s, and essentially made all the vaccine, such as what I received when I was a kid, all derived from a bovine source. So all the problems with the abnormal vaccines, the incidence of all these other diseases, the contamination, all that just went away in an instant when the shift was made to cows. Now, Joseph Jones concluded his report with this, and I thought it was a worthwhile statement to put up here. He thought that despite all the problems that the Confederacy had experienced, the problem wasn't with the nature of vaccine or vaccination process itself. It was with how it was being handled, safeguards that may have been overlooked, and the need to tighten up procedures, pay attention to sources of vaccine, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, he said, it's the greatest physical boon ever bestowed by a mortal upon the human race. And I say 3 cheers for that statement. Obviously, the photograph on the right is not a Civil War photograph. It was a publicity photograph from the 1940s. The woman being vaccinated on the thigh was a tattooed lady in the circus of renown. And it was a publicity photo to get people to vaccinate. But it's not quite the end of the story, because everything that I have just covered turned out to get very personal very fast in 2016 at the Mutter Museum. And very quickly, the kit that you saw earlier, and here you see a color picture of it down below on the lower right. Remember I said that little tin box had scab material? Well, I was with a colleague in our storage area one day, and I located in a drawer marked bloodletting tools approximately 5 of these little kits. And they all had either these glass plates in them covered with some kind of a filmy liquid that had dried, or they had those little tin boxes with scabs. This is 19th century material. And as I looked at this, I realized, first of all, I knew exactly what I was looking at because I just researched the issue that I'm talking about. But also I realized, wait a minute, this material could be infectious. And smallpox technically is an eradicated disease from the planet. I don't want to reopen that here. So I called the local public health authorities, and we know people at the Centers for Disease Control. And within about an hour or so, I was in a conference call with Pennsylvania Department of Health officials, Philadelphia officials, and the CDC. And they're talking over my head about, should we quarantine Robert about this and see if he gets something bad or no? The thing is, there have been a handful of circumstances where vaccine material from the 19th century has surfaced. In each case, it's surfaced in an archive, a library, or some of it showed up on a shelf in an old medical institution that had long forgotten it was there. No one can say that this material is not infectious, even though it's a century and a half old and maybe been sitting in a dark place. There's still an infection risk with any of this material, but this also gave us a chance to do something which has never been done. We have worked for a couple of years now with the Ancient DNA Center at McMaster University. They have the ability, which the CDC does not, by the way, to recover DNA through non-destructive testing of tools, of little samples such as we have in this little tin box from one of our vaccine kits. So we went through a process of sending our kits first to the CDC. The public health authorities, you saw them in the gowns and the face masks a moment ago, came to us, took the kits and took them to the CDC. Now the CDC, just as a matter of general interest, has never actually handled a sample of a human disease that dates before 1940. So this is an opportunity to look at something really distant. Also, this could have a key to understanding an evolutionary sequence of a major world disease, if DNA could be recovered. Well, they could only go so far as to say that their analysis showed the possibility of an unknown pox family virus in these kits. So we went through the World Health Organization to get permission to get into Canada, where these kits are at this moment. It's taken a few years, but genomes have been reconstructed out of 3 of the 5 kits. I am not at liberty to say much about that, but we just learned that the scientific paper about our kits has just been accepted for publication at a scientific journal called Genome Biology. And I don't know when it'll be published, but once that is out, it's probably going to get some attention because it does cast a light on a subject that has had no evidence. What I mean is, we've got all these textbooks talking about smallpox, vaccinia, cowpox, but until this time, this moment with our own specimens, no sample of an actual mid-19th century vaccine has survived anywhere. So we've got something that's not only historical evidence, but scientific evidence. And for a moment there, I thought I was going to be quarantined over it. So science can inform history, and these are some of the questions that we can ask. We can look at possibly the effectiveness of cowpox or vaccinia in the 19th century, maybe some of our ideas about how these vaccines might have actually operated, while they're working against or in tandem with the appearance of these other diseases. What does it mean? What does it mean for the disease? For example, syphilis. If syphilis was a coincident disease with some of these spurious vaccinations, we know that doctors at the time, when they saw that syphilis come back, tried to cure the syphilis, but the methods that they used for syphilis were no longer working in the person who had just been vaccinated and was getting these vaccination sores and ulcers. So you couldn't treat the syphilis. You had to sit out the smallpox part. But in the end, you had somebody who may have recovered from smallpox but still had venereal disease. All kinds of scientific questions here. And we just don't get the opportunity to do a longitudinal study of a major world disease and a vaccine that's been used for a couple hundred years in this way until now. So if you haven't had enough of this topic today, I have an essay on the spurious vaccination problem in the Confederacy in this book, which appeared last year. So I want to thank you very much for your time and attention today. I hope I didn't scare the bejesus out of you about vaccination. Go get vaccinations. If you can get vaccinated against anything, get it. And you won't have to worry about getting syphilis at the same time. I always like to conclude with a picture from the medical point of view of the true image of war. In this case, Alfred Stratton. These are famous photos of a disabled soldier from the Civil War. He lost both arms in a single action. A musket ball came in from the side and took off both his arms as he was holding his rifle. So with that picture in mind, Jake and Pete, I turn it back over to you.
Jake might have disappeared for a moment there. I definitely have at least one question that I want to ask you that I've been thinking about for a while. So as we wait for Jake to come back online, I'll kick off with my one question that I have. Did you find anything, or did Jones write in that report in 1867 anything about a distrust of medical professionals and a why were people vaccinating themselves? Why were soldiers taking it upon themselves to vaccinate? Was it a distrust of medical professionals? Was it just, hey, they're doing it, we can just do it ourselves easier?
I think that's a really good question. There may be, in some instances, a reluctance to trust the doctor. And as you know, sometimes Civil War doctors were caricatured. Even in the public mind at the time, images of too many amputations, Dr. Sawbones, doctor make you worse. And it's certainly true that after battles where a surgeon dealing with a serious problem may have up to only 90 seconds to make key life-saving decisions and then execute a technique and hope for the best. You don't have a time for niceties and bedside manner. It's also worth remembering that for soldiers coming into the Army, North or South, you may never have had experience directly with a physician. And if you did, it was somebody who made house calls. You didn't go to hospitals. So the fact that you're going to a military hospital to get treated is a new thing, and you may have had just a gut distrust of it. What is this institution all about? Do we really need it? Come on, I'm healthy, just leave me alone. Some soldiers we know resented having their bodies penetrated with some sort of a prophylactic measure like a vaccine. They would accept being operated on. Some of them, as you know, would refuse to be operated on. It was a life-saving procedure or refuse an amputation. The report itself, to my recollection, I can't recall any discussion in that spurious vaccination report about that reluctance. What I think is more likely is that soldiers recognized that they knew what smallpox looked like. They had probably seen it in the Army. They'd certainly seen it in civilian world. If they had grown up in any towns or cities, smallpox was endemic everywhere. So they would have seen somebody with it or knew what it was about. They thought, this is an easy one. I trust soldier buddies. I might trust my soldier buddies more than that doctor in the tent that I see every once in a while who refuses to give me furlough for a sprained ankle. And it looked like an easy fix. They can do it. Why can't I do it? It's just pricking a little sore and sticking in me, nothing to it. So all the steps on the flow chart that I developed, if the viewers take time with that, you can see all the decision points and all the considerations that the surgeon has to make that are not made by a soldier who just willy-nilly says, here, have at me. I got a disease here, just take some of this, you'll be fine. Would have no clue that the syphilis or any other disease or anything else in their bloodstream was going to get into the other body.
I don't need a mask. I'm not going to get it.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
We did have one other question that came in, I think, on Seminary Ridge Museum's side of the Facebook stream. Any information on Confederate POWs at Camp Douglas? Was it similar to Andersonville? Were they doing this at other Confederate POW camps?
When you say were they doing this,
I think were they in what you were talking about at the smallpox vaccinations there, or the experimentations?
I I can't recall mention of that specific camp.
Okay.
But remember, once Surgeon Moore sent those circulars giving step-by-step instructions to the doctors, they got to follow that stuff.
Sure.
Or if caught, doing something else, they could be court-martialed for that. And he was very strict about these instructions about the vaccination. In fact, the one thing I didn't mention is not only did he set up all those procedures down to the do this with your right hand, do this with your left hand, he decided that he can't even trust whatever vaccine sources these doctors might be finding. So he also directed everybody had to go through his office directly to make requests for a vaccine. So he alone ultimately provided the vaccine. So he was controlling absolutely everything. I mean, really micromanaging it in order to make a problem go away. But I'm sorry I can't shed any light on that specific.
Sure.
Question from our Facebook page from a good follower of ours, Wynn, asked what elements comprised a bad batch of smallpox vaccine?
One particular hazard, as I mentioned, they could use lymph to do the vaccination. I didn't put a lot of emphasis on the scab part, but the scab could be crushed and mixed with liquid in order to get a vaccine also. The difference between the vaccine and the lymph and the scab is that the scab had a better shelf life than the lymph. And the bad vaccine could be it could be a lymph that perhaps has been stored in a warm condition. It started to putrefy, and it might have been used in that state. So it's a biological material. I mean, it goes bad. It goes bad very fast. If you made up some lymph with those glass plates and water, you better use it up in under 24 hours, or you're going to have problems. So that's the main source of that impurity. Otherwise, it's simply somebody who has the pustules or gets the scab who also has other diseases and using that. So anything that was in that person's body is going to go into the healthy body with the vaccine. So that, a priori makes it impure.
Another question from our Facebook page is a question about the Andersonville and bad vaccines, asking about what primary sources did you use for that part of your research?
The trial of Henry Wirtz we have all the Q&A stuff. Also, Jones's own writings about this. It's part of it appears in the preface. He mentions a couple comments, I think, in the Spurious Vaccination Report, but also he publishes memoirs later on, and he republishes the Spurious Vaccination thing in his own volumes of memoirs, his other writings, where he editorializes on this a bit more. Doesn't have friendly things to say about the conclusion of the war, doesn't have friendly things to say about the Union, and the disappearance of all those medical records, which a lot of it he blames on Union soldiers as ransacking wagons and throwing things away and burning them. So his own memoir has those comments. And the biography of him, which I think is on my reading list, it's the only biography that exists of him. And there's more extensive quotation of his correspondence. And I think some of it appears in there. But the Wirtz trial stuff, those charges come up, that discussion comes up, because Jones testifies at that trial.
Pete, do you have anything else? I have one other kind of off the wall question from Facebook, but I think it's a good one. But I wanted to see if you had any.
Yeah, the only question that I had was when in reference to looking at doing the vaccines in public. Was it just Richmond, or was it other large cities in the South, small cities in the South, where the armies were? What sort of guidance were they getting on that?
Essentially, there was military presence in every major southern city.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be a surgeon who was assigned to a regiment who got the job of, you're now going to be the public immunization guy.
Okay.
We are going to require the public to get vaccinated. There was not an opportunity to do that wholesale through the Confederacy before the war ended, but the process started. Probably went in fits and starts in some places. So every urban area had some physician assigned to do this. But I don't know to what extent it was carried out everywhere.
Sure. Thanks. That was my question. So.
All right. So this one comes from Crystal on our Facebook page. And she typed this message. She said, my third great grandfather died from tertiary syphilis. He died at Williamsburg Asylum, had paralytic dementia, and died at age 44, was admitted to Chimborazo with VS of left hand, May of 1864. What is VS?
With VS?
Yeah, I have not come across that.
It says that on some medical record, he's entered with VS?
VS of left hand.
I'd have to look that up. I've got some medical glossaries at the time, but I'll make a note of that. VS of left hand.
Yeah, VS of left hand.
VS of left hand.
Congratulations, Crystal! You stumped all three of us.
Yeah, that's one that I have not encountered.
Yeah,
before. Crystal, if you do want to send a direct message to the museum with your email or contact information, we can get back in touch with this. This
Sure.
is a great question.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up and see if I can find it. I can't recall offhand what that might mean. It's interesting about you have that record and documented experiences. I visited the Williamsburg Asylum. It's a museum now, but it's mostly set up to show how it looked in the 18th century. But of course, during the Civil War, they were using all those resources. But,
all right. Well, yeah. That's all the questions that I have for today. Pete, any last thoughts?
No, this was fantastic. People seem to really be enjoying it. I enjoyed it. So thank you very, very much. It's always great when the three of us can get together and talk about medicine, and I hope we get to do this more.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks very much for inviting me, and thanks everyone out there for listening, and wear their masks.
Yes, wear those masks. And if you are enjoying these programs that we're doing, please take a moment, like the video, share the video, become a member of our institutions, donate to our institutions. That helps us support us in these troubled times that we're all living in when we can't be open to the public. And hope you all stay safe out there, and we'll be doing programs like this again real soon. Thanks, everyone.
All right. So long.